Following the military takeover in Niger, many significant events have taken place. Some of these events are unprecedented, like the ECOWAS threat to invade Niger and restore the deposed government by force. But a more significant thing that has happened is the immediate suspension of aid to Niger by Western countries led by France and the EU. This act speaks volumes and needs to be analyzed properly. This is exactly what this video seeks to achieve. Why is it that the first act of the West was to suspend aid to Niger? What is the real intention behind the foreign aid that is given to Africa? How is it that Niger, just like most African countries, has received billions in foreign aid and yet remains as underdeveloped and poor as ever? All of these fundamental questions need to be answered so that Africans can come to understand how things really work. To begin, let me refer to another important event which has happened after the coup in Niger. France has also suspended development and budget aid to Burkina Faso. This is because Burkina Faso, together with Mali, declared solidarity with the soldiers in Niger. Simply put, France is seeking to punish Burkina Faso for taking a position that goes against French interests. Clearly, France considers foreign aid a tool it can use to control African governments, and when these governments get out of line, they withdraw the aid to punish them. How can it be that so much development aid has been given to Niger and Burkina Faso all these years, and yet no real development has been achieved? Over 40% of the population in Niger and Burkina Faso are living in extreme poverty. Clearly, foreign aid has not been designed to fight poverty or bring about development, but to keep African countries like Niger and Burkina Faso permanently dependent so as to make possible the unrestrained exploitation of their resources. In other words, France, the USA, and other Western countries offer so-called aid to Africa to ensure that we are dependent on them for survival. As the great African leader Thomas Sankara said, "He who feeds you controls you."
Notre pays produit suffisamment de quoi nous nourrir. Nous pouvons dépasser même notre production, malheureusement. Par manque d'organisation, nous sommes encore obligés de tendre la main pour demander des aides alimentaires. Ces aides alimentaires qui nous bloquent, qui nous inspirent, qui installent dans nos esprits cette habitude, ces réflexes de mendiant, d'assister. Nous devons mettre de côté ces aides par notre grande production. Il faut réussir à produire plus. Produire plus. Produire plus parce que il est normal que celui qui vous donne à manger vous dicte également.
This is a fundamental principle that every nation that seeks to be truly independent must abide by. But unfortunately, the many sellout African leaders we have no interest in this. As a result, they happily keep Africa dependent on foreign powers. To understand how foreign aid is used to control and exploit Africa, one must look at Thomas Sankara and his time in office as the president of Burkina Faso. Unlike the many governments across Africa today, Sankara categorically rejected foreign aid, including those from the IMF and the World Bank. Here is an observation he made about foreign aid and the lack of development in Burkina Faso as far back as 1984 at the United Nations, an observation that remains true today. Very few countries have been inundated like mine with all kinds of aid. Theoretically, this aid is supposed to work in the interest of our development. In the case of what was formerly Upper Volta, one searches in vain for a sign of anything having to do with development. Being aware of this contradiction, Thomas Sankara made clear the only kind of aid his government was going to consider. He stated in this regard that aid must go in the direction of strengthening our sovereignty, not undermining it. Aid should go in the direction of destroying aid. All aid that kills aid is welcome in Burkina Faso, but we will be compelled to abandon all aid that creates a welfare mentality. Sankara further added, "Of course we encourage aid that aids us in doing away with aid, but in general, welfare and aid policies have only ended up disorganizing us, subjugating us, and robbing us of a sense of responsibility for our own economic, political, and cultural affairs." Clearly, Thomas Sankara was very much aware of how foreign aid is used as a weapon to keep Africa dependent and worked to chart a new path. All across Africa today, you will find governments that are heavily reliant on foreign aid to run their countries. One may even think that Africa cannot do without foreign aid. This is why the example of Thomas Sankara is very important, because he proves that a poor African country can develop without foreign aid. This is also why he was a great threat that needed to be eliminated, because the Western powers want Africans to believe that Africa needs foreign aid to survive. Without foreign aid, Thomas Sankara was able to significantly transform Burkina Faso and massively improve the lives of Burkinabés. In terms of infrastructure, many schools, health centers, reservoirs, and dispensaries were constructed. Infant mortality and illiteracy were greatly reduced when we look at human development. Also, Burkina Faso attained very high food sufficiency under Thomas Sankara. All of these wonderful achievements were within a space of 4 years, and more importantly, all of it was achieved without any foreign aid. Today in Africa, we cry about a war in Ukraine because it means we cannot import food. Despite all the foreign aid given to Niger, only 56% of Nigerians have access to safe drinking water, and millions of Nigerians are at risk of hunger. These contradictions I describe are far from unique to Niger. Literally all African countries have significant portions of their populations living in extreme poverty, with limited access to the basic needs of life, in spite of all the billions in so-called aid Africa receives. In order to properly expose foreign aid in Africa, let us look at the food crisis that was affecting Niger long before the coup. Most regions in Niger are in a state of acute food insecurity, with only 56% of the population having access to safe drinking water. Niger's farmers have difficulty finding enough for their crops. All this has contributed to about 44% of Niger's children suffering from acute malnutrition and about 5 million Nigerians facing food insecurity. Despite repeated appeals by Niger's government for financial assistance from the international community to develop irrigation systems and other agricultural infrastructure, this has largely fallen on deaf ears. Western governments have instead mainly focused on military assistance to Niger and neglected the critical need for technical and financial assistance to the agricultural sector. Over the past decade, the US has provided Niger with more than $500 million in military assistance and training programs. The European Union has also allotted $554 million for assistance to Niger during the 2021 to 2024 period, supposedly for sustainable growth, education, and governance. In 2022, France's own development aid to Niger amounted to $130 million, while US aid totaled $101 million. The West has allocated all this money to Niger and overlooked the most critical need to address the problems with water scarcity and food production. This is very telling. In fact, this tells the whole story. Financial aid to enable Niger gain the capacity to achieve some food security is not forthcoming from the West, precisely because self-reliance cannot be allowed. Niger cannot be allowed to be able to feed its people, otherwise Niger can no longer be easily controlled. Rather, the West prefers to offer aid that deepens their control over Niger and makes Niger ever more dependent. Again, I have to state that this reality is not exclusive to Niger, because you are going to find the very same story in basically every other African country. Having followed the dictates of the World Bank, most African countries have lost the capacity to feed themselves. Corrupt sellout African leaders have willingly followed World Bank policies that demanded that all support and protection for local food producers be removed and foreign food imports be allowed in without restrictions. This has ensured that Africa is dependent on others to feed her people, despite all the vast arable lands we have. A former Nigerian Minister of Agriculture, Odu Ogbe, highlighted the absurdity of IMF and World Bank policies to make Nigeria dependent on foreign food imports.
In 1986, we had this thing called the Structural Adjustment Program dumped on Africa.
That destroyed most countries in Africa.
Everything. And I am sorry to say, I am not an economist. I was in Hong Kong visiting with a friend when we heard on television that the auctioning began in April.
Auctioning of our national currency.
Exactly. And it was 3 naira to $1.
1986.
Yes. And economists in Nigeria said it was the only way out. Now, economics is honestly 90% common sense. Why are you auctioning your currency when what to do is to cut down on imports
and boost
and stimulate
export.
local production. Why are you shipping in rice? That one began as far back as 1982, a task force on the importation of rice. I was a young man in the cabinet. I was 34 years old. And I asked the question, why not a task force for the production of rice? I was told, oh, you guys from the university, you don't know anything. In the interim, let's just import. The bill rose to $5 million a day and remained so for nearly 30 years.
From the Taiwanese?
Yes. Taiwan, from Thailand, Vietnam, and even India. You just ship your money out and ship in goods. And once the structural adjustment came, we added onto it free trade. So we opened our windows, our doors, our roofs, and any foreign good was arriving.
Dumped in.
Plastics that wouldn't last an hour in the hand of a child as toys, honey, sugar, milk, toothpicks, handkerchiefs, pins on the table. We produce nothing. If you go to your house and look around,
practically everything.
What is it that is made here? Almost nothing. And we said it was perfect. Why? Oil and gas money. You ship out oil, send the proceeds to sustain other economies and bring in their goods. Along with the goods, unemployment and poverty
Started.
Yeah.
So we lost all our institutions,
yes.
Industries.
Yes, exactly.
The granite pyramids in the north.
Everything disappeared because it was no longer fashionable.
The textile industry
to go to the farm. So, if you go to the southeast, between 1982 and 1990, 510 industries sprang up. I think the Igbos then decided, rather than trade, we'll produce. Less than 90 of those industries are still running. The factories have closed, their owners have died.
500 industries.
In the east, the owners have died, their dreams have died. All of this is being caused by a fundamental problem. There is discomfort.
There is major discontent all over the place.
Young people have nothing to aspire to. Young people can't think of a day when they will marry, have a flat of their own, own a job, and even if they have a job today, the wage is too low.
Unfortunately, these clearly destructive policies were embraced by our own so-called leaders. Clearly, these leaders have no care for their own people. Now, here is a fact that will shock many people. Did you know that far more money leaves Africa every year than all the foreign aid Africa receives? In a report by the United Nations, it was revealed that Africa lost nearly $89 billion a year in illicit financial flows such as tax evasion and theft, amounting to more than it receives in development aid. In fact, this figure is said to be underestimated due to data limitations. So the report confirms one fact, that Africa is a net creditor to the world, not a net debtor. A key fact that must be noted is that the conditionalities that come with foreign aid is what has made it possible for foreign corporations to easily exploit Africa and move out the ridiculous profits they make easily. Following the dictates of the IMF and World Bank, African governments have privatized their key assets and natural resources, and also granted all kinds of tax exemptions to foreign companies. Take for example the French company Areva, which mines uranium in Niger. An Oxfam report has revealed how 2 subsidiaries of Areva in Niger benefit from a number of tax advantages. Exemptions from duties, VAT, and even fuel taxes, which they use in massive amounts. A provision for the reconstruction of mines also lets them set aside 20% of their profits, which are therefore excluded from corporate taxes. According to Oxfam, in 2010, the 2 subsidiaries extracted a total of over 100,000 metric tons of uranium in Niger, representing an export value of 2.3 trillion CFA francs. From that sum, Niger was only paid 300 billion CFA francs, or 13% of the exported value. In concluding, the Oxfam report states that it is incomprehensible that Niger, one of the world's largest uranium producers and a strategic supplier for Areva in France, is not taking advantage of the revenue from this extraction and remains one of the poorest countries on the planet. This shocking state of affairs has been created mainly by the conditionalities attached to foreign aid that is designed to open up countries to be easily exploited. Niger is far from the only African country where foreign corporations are the major beneficiaries from the natural resource wealth. The gold in Ghana, Mali, and Burkina Faso benefits foreigners at the expense of the citizens who are the real owners of the wealth. The story is the same all across Africa. It is this ridiculous reality about the fact that far more wealth leaves Africa than the aid that comes in that Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah described in his book Neocolonialism in these words. Aid, therefore, to a neo-colonial state is merely a revolving credit paid by the neo-colonial master, passing through the neo-colonial state and returning to the neo-colonial master in the form of increased profits. The wealth that is taken out of Africa far outweighs all the so-called aid that comes in. This simply means that if Africa took control of her resources and closed all the loopholes, there will be absolutely no need for foreign aid. Some may wonder why African leaders have failed to do this and choose to keep their various countries artificially dependent on foreign aid. The reason is simple. It is because these corrupt leaders only care about their self-interest and not about the best interest of their people. The so-called aid is used to buy these selfish leaders to ensure that they allow Africa's resources to be looted by foreigners, and also to ensure that they allow African workers to be exploited in their own land. It is this reality of corruption that led Thomas Sankara to reject foreign aid. When questioned about the kind of foreign aid he rejects, Thomas Sankara said, "We reject aid that buys off consciences and that provides benefits only for the leaders. If you offer us aid to facilitate our purchase of your products or to enable certain of us to open up bank accounts in your country, we will turn it down." Since this video is inspired by events in Niger and the reaction of the French, I cannot help but remember the story of Guinea's independence in 1958. After the people of Guinea opted for true political independence instead of joining a new colonial French community created by France, the French reacted in a cruel manner by wickedly destroying infrastructure in the country with the intention of crippling Guinea. This event clearly showed the true face of France and the West, which is only to dominate and exploit Africa. If there was one lesson Africa should have learned from that episode, it is to work to ensure that we are never dependent on others, especially France. But thanks to sellout African leaders, here we are. If the story of Guinea in 1958 did not serve as a cautionary tale, that of Niger and Burkina Faso in 2023 must serve as an example about the dangers of being dependent on others for survival. That dependence will always be used as leverage to control and exploit you, and when you get out of line, it will be withdrawn to punish you. He who feeds you will always control you, and he who does not feed you certainly cannot control you. Knowing that Africa does not need foreign aid to survive, and that all we need to do is to take control over our resources, there is no justification for the status quo to remain. It is about time that as Africans we open our eyes and see the game that is being played on us by the West in collaboration with our sellout leaders. We cannot continue to drown in hopelessness and misery. Enough of the poverty and suffering in a land of abundant riches. Thomas Sankara proved that we can do without foreign aid, and his example must inspire and guide all of us in this struggle for a prosperous and united Africa. Please do support us by subscribing to our channel and sharing the video with others. Do leave a comment if possible. Thank you so much for watching.